Okay, I want to welcome everyone who's tuning in to tonight's webinar. I'm really excited for this webinar and am pleased to be your moderator. I'm Mark Varian, one of the research archaeologists at Crow Canyon. And this talk tonight is also sponsored by the Hisatsinom Chapter of the Colorado Archaeological Society. And it's entitled Being Sheepminded, an Ethnoarchaeological Study of Navajo Pastoralism and its Historical Trajectory by Wade Campbell. So do you advance for me, Taylor? Thanks. Just a few logistics to start with. If you're tuning in on Zoom, you'll see your split screen and you can move that bar to minimize the size of the talking heads and maximize the size of Wade's presentation. There's also a live transcription that'll show up at the bottom that's helpful and also worth a few giggles every once in a while when it gets words wrong. And we will take questions at the end of this talk. And the best way to do that is at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. And if you click on that, you can type your question in there and Wade will take your questions at the end of his talks. If you're having any difficulties with this Zoom format, you can head over to Crow Canyon's Facebook page at crowcanyon.org/Facebook, and we're streaming this talk live there. Also, one of the best things about these talks is we record them and Taylor gets them published on YouTube the next day. So I found it really helpful to be able to go back to particular parts of talks that I was really interested in and listen to them again. So if you have to leave early or you just want to check something out again, you can see this talk again on YouTube. Welcome to the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. I assume most folks tuning in know a little bit about us based on this year-long webinar series we've been doing, and maybe former participating with us in our programs at Crow Canyon. But this is a picture of our campus with the iconic Sleeping Ute Mountain in the background. And our mission is to empower present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. And I'd really encourage you to check out our website. It has lots of educational and research materials, and you can find that at www.crowcanyon.org. The Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Diné, Navajo, and Hickory Apache people on whose traditional homelands this institution sits and upon which we work and reside. Our mission-related work would not be possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future. We respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. Crow Canyon is grateful to all Indigenous people and supports the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. We've had a very generous Crow Canyon trustee who made a $50,000 challenge match to support the presentation of this webinar series during 2021. So for every dollar you donate, it's matched for $1 up to $50,000. The bar shows we're about 17,000 left to go. So if you choose to make a donation, it really makes a difference in our ability to present this webinar series. And those donations are easy to make on Crow Canyon's website. Please consider that. The upcoming webinar is a Four Corners lecture series, which is a local lecture series that is sponsored by a variety of institutions, including Crow Canyon. This next webinar is going to be Preserving and Exhibiting Jewelry from Mary Coulter by Dr. Tara Travis. So really looking forward to that next Thursday, August 26th. COVID has hit all of our communities hard, and especially many of our Indigenous neighbors here in the Four Corners. And these are a number of sites that you can contribute to help those communities. the Pueblo Relief Fund, Hopi Relief Fund, Navajo and Hopi Families COVID Relief Fund, and the official Navajo Nation COVID-19 Relief Fund. There's the links, and this is a really good example of if you don't have a pen handy and you want to do this, you can go to the YouTube publication tomorrow and find these addresses, look up these organizations, see the great work that they're doing in their communities, and help support that work. So hope you consider that as well. So that brings us to our talk tonight, which I am really excited about, being sheep-minded with Wade Campbell. Wade is a Diné Navajo archaeologist whose research engages with broad questions concerning the long-term history of Navajo settlement across the American Southwest. His current work explores the colonial era relationship between the Navajo, Spanish, and other local groups in the American Southwest as it relates to pastoralism and eventual changes in land use, social organization, and diet and subsistence practices at about AD 1700. Wade also maintains interest in a wide array of issues, including the practice of indigenous archaeology, cultural resource management, Native American higher education, and West African archaeology. So Wade, thank you very much for being our presenter tonight. I'm going to stop my video and mute myself and turn it over to you.
Okay, no, thank you, Mark, and my thanks to Taylor and the rest of the Crow Canyon staff as well for the invitation to speak and helping to iron out all the little kinks along the way. All right, give me 1 second as I switch over screens. Come on, there we go. Okay. Well, thank you again for the introduction, and for everybody else. Yate, Che Wade Campbell, Yanishia, Kia Ani Nishna, Bilagana, Bushes Chain, Hana Dasha Che, Although Bilagana Dashanella. My name is Wade Campbell. I am a almost done archaeology PhD student at Harvard University. Originally from the Four Corners region, my work focuses on trying to better understand early Navajo herding within the context of the colonial period Southwest and before. I'm really excited to have the chance to talk to you all today, and I wanted to say thank you for logging in, sitting through what I promise will be a hopefully exciting talk, and I'll try to keep it relatively short and as focused as I possibly can. And my thanks in particular to those of my family members and friends who have logged in. I very much appreciate it, and I appreciate the support. The title of my talk is Being Sheepminded, an ethnoarchaeological study of Navajo pastoralism and its historical trajectory. Some of you may have heard various bits of this at different conferences and presentations and such over the years. Most recently at the 2021 PECOS conference in Mancos a couple weekends ago. This, I assure you, will be better, if only because there are photos this time, so you don't need to use your imagination. But let's see here. Okay, what I'm going to talk about today is essentially the role of sheep in Navajo culture and explore how the relationship between people and their animals has varied over time, today and further into the past. I am going to reflect on the poorly understood history of Diné sheep herding during the Spanish colonial period, and discuss my recent dissertation research on this topic, which is grandiosely titled the Early Navajo Pastoral Landscape Project, and the ways in which indigenous archaeology as a whole can help us to better understand a range of issues, including topics like incipient herding among Native American populations. Okay, so I guess without further ado, we need to jump right in. Right, the title of this talk, being sheep-minded, is a reference to the work of earlier anthropologists, in particular, a gentleman by the name of Gary Witherspoon, who in the 70s lived and worked on the Navajo Nation. And he wrote an article which was entitled Sheep in Navajo Culture and Social Organization, and in that article, he riffed on the work of an earlier anthropologist who had wrote in the 1930s named Gladys Reichart, who was well known for her study of Navajo religion and social structure and the like. And in his article, he played with this idea of sheep-mindedness. Particularly, he highlighted how sheep and herding were central elements within Navajo thought and Navajo culture at the time. And in particular, he focused on how the human-animal relationship helped to structure other relationships in people's lives, and in particular, how caring for animals taught a range of moral and sort of moral social lessons, I suppose. And this idea, right, that if you care for them, they will in turn care for you. That idea of this sort of reciprocity of kinship between both people and also the inanimate world, right, is fundamentally grounded in the Navajo concept of teh, or sort of relationality in between people. And I find this, a really powerful message, in part because, well, now 50 years after Witherspoon wrote this article, sheep and sheep herding play a really important role in contemporary 21st century Navajo society, despite the fact that the economic importance and even the social importance of sheep and herding in Navajo life has decreased substantially. The greater incorporation of Navajo people, the Navajo Nation, into the American state and into the sort of Western economy with wage work and these sorts of things has meant that large-scale herding and the lifestyles that come with it, including like secondary economies like rug weaving or wool selling and the like, have been replaced as the primary form of livelihood for most Navajo families. And despite this shift, what I find really intriguing is that sheep-mindedness persists, right? There is this historic image of Navajo people that comes to mind, these sort of sepia-toned little vignettes, these sort of Curtis-esque photographs of the Southwest. When you see folks in Navajo, they're almost always weaving, making jewelry, or they're herding sheep out on the landscape, a lone herder and this massive flock of sheep running around. And even now, sheep and the sheep herding lifestyle, I think, functions as a particularly notable privilege marker of traditional life and sort of cultural authenticity. You often hear people talk about sheep and sheep is life. That's the Bepeina. It comes up in discussions about cultural preservation, traditional crafts, ecological knowledge, and traditional diet. They all revolve around sheep. And as this photo shows here on the right, the Miss Navajo Nation pageant, right? Every year at the Navajo Nation Fair, young ladies compete to be crowned Miss Navajo. And in a departure from other pageants around the world, there's no swimsuit contest or anything like that, but rather these women are judged on their cultural fluency and their abilities to be strong, independent Navajo women, Navajo leaders. And in that, they have to display their facility with the Nebazad, the Navajo language, their public speaking abilities, and their facility with different modern and traditional skills, including sheep butchering, right? And I think, so if the Miss Navajo contest is sort of one pulse of the state of 21st century Navajo culture, you have these other elements too, right? Where even today on social media, this persistence of sheep as a really important marker, despite the fact that its economic importance has declined. You see this sort of stuff around. The Navajos are kind of little memes and jokes and gifts that harken back to this lifestyle. And this persistence, as I'm saying, is something that really intrigues me because, again, it's declined since the 70s, even, and before that, since these high points around the turn of the 20th century. And other folks have paid attention to this. There's books like Dreaming of Sheep in Navajo Country by Marsha Weisiger, If You Take My Sheep by the Baileys. That these works, these studies examine the importance of sheep herding in particular, but livestock in general in Navajo life during the late 1800s and 20th century. But if you sort of delve into it, one of the things that kind of stands out is that, well, all these studies, in particular, discussions about the impact of the livestock reduction policies of the late 20s and into the 30s and 40s, these were hugely traumatic moments, and there's a lot of turmoil that I think today is still felt in many ways by a lot of people. If we go back a little further, a few decades further, our ability to discuss the relationship between those moments and what came before drops off substantially, in part because a lot of these studies have been historical or rely on oral histories. And while they do a good job of accessing key moments, the further you go back in time, the less accessible, the less prevalent these records are. And in particular, with written records, one of the things that you find is that they become very one-sided. You have Americans, and before that, Spaniards, writing about Navajo people. And when you dive into these texts, you do get a story, you do get some sort of picture of what Navajo herding was like. But you do not get a good sense of what Navajo people were actually doing and the intensity of those activities and how the introduction was managed, how people first came upon these animals and started to build herds, and how that affected interactions with others. And so, as I realized this, my focus was drawn to this earlier period. The Spanish colonized New Mexico in 1598, so 1600 more or less. And over the course of about 150 years, you have the Navajo herding tradition go from essentially 0 to 100, a lot. And we have a quote from one of the Spanish governors of New Mexico in the 1790s, Fernando Chacon, saying that Navajos do not want for sheep because those they possess are innumerable. So this fascinates me. And how is that uptick managed? How do you deal with the fact that a new economy, a new way of life will unavoidably restructure the interactions that you have with families, friends, neighbors, and the environment? These are all questions that I think archaeology can help us understand. And so with that in mind, though, archaeology can help us understand those things. And I want to sort of step back and say, when I talk about archaeology, I am talking about, in particular, not just the field, but an indigenous archaeology, right? If archaeology is a systematic study of the human past through material remains, it's a common textbook definition. An indigenous archaeology is one that does this with, for, and by indigenous peoples. And these ideas have been discussed and worked over since the late 80s, early 90s. And the work of Sonia Adelaide and others in the mid-2000s is a particularly kind of important touchstone. And I think if you break these concepts down, what emerges is this idea of with, for, and by, right? Is well, like kind of what we're seeing here. There's a focus on encouraging Native individuals to become researchers, to take control over the questions that are being asked, as well as collaborating with those people who are interested in being allies and exploring questions from a different angle. There's a focus on indigenous methodologies, right? And this varies from tribe to tribe, community to community. But at the forefront, it centers tribal histories, tribal beliefs, and tribal interests as they relate to work that is being done. And one of the interesting kind of effects of this is that these beliefs and interests may not mesh with what a lot of people are taught or have traditionally been taught in archaeology programs, right? So maybe you are not permitted to dig and excavate. Maybe you need to figure out some other way of asking those questions. Adopt new methodologies, adopt new techniques. By sort of, in a sense, by limiting yourself, you're forced to innovate. And I think that's a really powerful aspect of this. And the last bit, right, is that it has this sort of decolonizing aim, which, as like I said earlier, by incorporating different viewpoints, by adopting different approaches, you end up with results that I think have the power to challenge traditional narratives and let Native people have, probably for the first time in over a century that archaeology has been practiced, particularly in the Southwest, take ownership of how those stories are told and explore the ways in which Native people today have connections, well, not have connections, right? The connections Native people have with the past are real, are being maintained, and they're continuing on into the future. And I think archaeology, with its really unique material lens on the past, can hit a lot of these points along that kind of timeline. All right, so with that sort of definition kind of out there, let's go ahead and get back to the discussion of sheep. Right, so I wanted to look at those questions. I wanted to do it in a way that I thought was ethically, methodologically, and sort of intellectually valid, I suppose. And at the core, I was interested in this relationship between humans and animals and pastoralism, right? This idea that you become dependent on herd animals that are held as property. They're not just sort of wandering around, but that's my sheep, that's my horse. And that working with them demands a degree of mobility after a point. Because if you keep them in the same place, you'll strip the landscape, you'll deplete your resources, and you need to move to some degree. So with that in mind, I found myself wondering, right, what was the nature of Diné herding within the unique social context of the Spanish colonial era Southwest in the late 1600s, early 1700s? And well, like I said, people have been doing archaeology in the Southwest for over a century, and this theme, regardless of the Navajo aspect, the theme of sort of pastoralism has never really been examined in great depth by archaeologists in the Southwest. And so why might that be the case, and how can we start to look at those questions? And so basically I developed this project that I'll lay out some of the methods in a few minutes, but at its core, it tries to answer these 2 points. All right, so the setting, right? The setting of the early Navajo Pastoral Landscape project is Spanish colonial New Mexico, El Nuevo Mexico, right? As this map on the right shows, while we think today of New Mexico as the state, the original sort of Spanish colony was a really fragile, tenuous sort of thing that stretched along the Rio Grande River Valley. A few sort of European settlements and the Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley, and then also sort of Acoma, Laguna, Zuni, Hopi, and the like. And in this world, it was a colonial one. There was an unequal balance of power between the Spanish and the native communities that they controlled. But as I said, it was a tenuous balance, and beyond those sort of shifting borders of the New Mexico colony, there was a lot of a lot of, well, we don't know quite well what it was. We know, and so when the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 occurred, this world was kind of upended. The reestablishment of the colony of Mexico led to this unique blend of sort of three cultures that we see today. But again, if we look beyond sort of that core, what we see is there are people in the hinterlands. The Comanches are, the Utes and Comanches are some of the best studied cases. You have folks like Dr. Lindsay Montgomery or Dr. Severn Fowles, who are doing a lot of work up in northern New Mexico, looking at the interaction between these groups, sort of mixed ethnicity communities in northern New Mexico and the Pueblos. And people have adopted a variety of frameworks, theoretical frameworks, to help them understand what might be going on beyond colonial borders, right? You have discussions of sort of middle ground colonialism, colonial borderlands or frontiers, and they all have their sort of attendant baggage. And I think while they're useful for studying certain contexts through certain lenses, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And at least in the Navajo case, I think that these previous frameworks kind of don't do a good job of delving into what was going on in early Navajo communities, in particular with regards to the adoption of Western resources like European domesticates, animal domesticates, new technologies, new materials. And so, at the core of my approach is this idea of sort of peri-colonialism, which is a kind of theoretical concept that is anchored in Native American Indigenous studies, literary studies roots, and it's a flexible framework in which it essentially argues that people who are not directly colonized still experienced similar effects to those people who were directly controlled and overseen by colonial powers. But the power of peri-colonialism is that it flips the lens from being dependent on sort of textual studies written by one party, generally educated sort of European Western folks, and offers a way to use the archaeological record, to use oral histories, and to use those textual resources as well to create a more holistic, a richer story about the past and how those people were responding to outside influences. I had earlier said that Navajo archaeology in the Southwest didn't have a very good grasp, I feel, of pastoralism and its effects, and part of this is because, well, the vast majority of work on early Navajo archaeology has been focused on these sorts of sites here that you see on the right. You have former Crow Canyon archaeologist Tim Wilcox at the Navajo Pueblito site of Francis Ruin. The early emphasis on Navajo archaeology is focused on these Pueblito sites, in part because they're readily visible on the landscape. They're impressive. They lend themselves well to sort of the earlier focus of Southwestern archaeology and the methods that were being applied. But the end result has been that by looking at these sort of massive sites, which are fortresses, they're special places on the landscape, larger synthetic discussions about how people were living day to day haven't been able really to touch on sort of these daily practices like the herding of sheep, the planting of crops, and these sort of general economic practices. And so while we have faunal remains from these sorts of sites that give some direct evidence that people were consuming Western domesticates like sheep, goat, horse, cattle, and the like, we don't actually have a good handle on what happened in the lead up to the consumption of that animal. right? And that is the core of pastoralism, right? That dynamic between humans and animals, the care that people put in, the development of that sheep-mindedness. And so to look at that then, what I wanted to do was take a different tact, one that tries to identify those places on the landscape where people were moving and interacting with the animals. And so this next slide here, you sort of see what I'm talking about, the contrast between these sort of special use fortress sites and Navajo Hogan sites, the kind of traditional homes that people lived in the past and even to this day. And you see there's a lot of continuity. You know, on the right you have, on the upper left you have an early 18th century fork stick hogan, and you have a replica on the right, and an early 20th century hogan. You can see that there are these similar traditions that are maintained throughout. And what I want to talk about here, right, talking about sort of the pastoral landscape, one of the things that sort of helped push me in this direction of examining these landscape type features was this site, LA 113-103. And it deserves mention because, well, it is one of these traditional home sites. It's not a fortress. Doesn't have anything, you know, overwhelmingly kind of crazy. But I think there are some lessons here for the ways in which a Pueblito-focused archaeology can be expanded. And what we have here on the left is that there was a survey in the Dinétah region of northwestern New Mexico, and that identified this site. And the initial identification said that those structures there were all hogans, these habitations. And it was only a few years later, when a pipeline went through, that CRM work was done by the same company that did the survey, actually. And what they found was that one of the structures that had been ID'd on the surface as a habitation, as a home, as a hogan, had a completely subsurface layer of organic rich material that looked like dung. Some soil tests were taken, and lo and behold, the soils from that layer came back, you know, 10 to 100 times higher than the control samples for the surrounding landscape. And the argument was made that this site was to be reinterpreted as a early Navajo pen or penning or corralling feature. So with that in mind, right, that there is evidence for early Navajo animal husbandry, right, the attendant practices that surround the care and use of these animals. I turn my attention towards this idea of pastoral landscapes, right? Essentially focusing on, again, that interaction between humans, animals, and the landscape. And it's an approach that has seen success in other parts of the world. Archaeologists in Central Asia and the Near East have all done work that looks at the relationship on the landscape between habitation sites and features that are linked to pastoralism. This idea of pastoral infrastructure, right? Corrals, pens. There are also even things like cairns, reservoirs, watering holes, trails, paths. And using that approach, they're able to sort of analyze the interactions, the networks that people were engaged in with their animals. And so with this infrastructure focus, what results is a focus on not just excavation, but actually trying to collect multiple lines of evidence that speak to the presence and management of domestic animals on the landscape by peoples. And through the pastoral landscape approach, one of the key elements that emerges is the importance of the soil itself, where soil is a key consideration in part because the deposition of dung that results when you corral enclose a herd in a place for any sort of substantial amount of time, it results in the deposition of dung that subtly changes the geochemical and microscopic character of those soils. And identifying these types of landscapes then and these features should allow us to look at the relationships as a whole. What you can see here is a modern Navajo sheep camp, which it was one of the areas where I worked at the start for my project, and you can see this relationship sort of unfold. There's this large corral with really distinct staining that results from the animals being kept in these corral areas consistently. But there's also a range of other features around, right? A corral for horses, reservoirs, fields, and a number of different habitation sites. And so the idea, again, is if you can identify these features and look at the relationships between them, you can start to get a better handle for how people were interacting with their animals and each other in the past. So with that in mind, what I'm going to talk about now is some of the results from these different fieldwork periods. So the first phase of work took place in 2018 and was held at my family's sheep camp with the assistance of my aunt and other relatives. And most recently, there was a fieldwork campaign in 2019, the start of 2020, in Dinétah, sort of red circle over there, the traditional Navajo homeland, which today, ironically enough, is located off the boundaries of the Navajo Nation. In this first phase of work, right, I lived and worked as a sheep herder under the capable direction of my aunt at my family's, my extended family's sheep camp on Black Mesa. The goal of all this work was to develop familiarity with the archaeological signatures of various pastoral activities. You know, what happens when you take animals out day in, day out, pen them in the same place? You know, what do you start to see? What do you start to notice? And to sort of standardize and reflect on those observations and collect data that might help me understand how similar activities may have been done in the past, and to also get an appreciation for how this quintessential Navajo activity has changed over time, and also its persistence into the modern day. Here on the lower right, you'll see that I recently wrote an article that will be out in this upcoming issue, the fall issue of the journal Kiva, that talks about this in greater detail. So if you really want to dive into the weeds, keep an eye out for that. But as summarized here, the main activities that I conducted as a part of this work was engaging in the daily herding and care of around 250 sheep and goats, plus a range of other ranching tasks, like shearing, prepping for sales, cleaning the stock tank, repairing different aspects of the camp, and chasing cows at night, things like that. And like I said, during the course of all these events, I kept an eye out for archaeological sites, older sheep camps, and other types of features, and then contextualize them by talking with my aunt and other relatives to sort of better understand what my ancestors really had been doing in those areas, and how what was remembered was reflected in the archaeological record. Oh, and then the last bit too, if you can see here, the goat that's chewing on my hand there, around his neck, he has a GPS collar. They were jokingly referred to as GPS units, but the idea was to record the places that the herd went during the daily herding round, and to get a sense of the the daily demands in terms of distance and time, and also kind of how the landscape was being used at different parts of the 6 months that I was there. And last but not least, what ended up happening was, well, what you have here, I'll start this, and you can sort of see it unfolding as I talk, but basically what you see are the tracks from 6 months of going out with the sheep day after day. And at the end of this first research period, what I ended up doing was taking a 10-day period to revisit all these sites, formally record them, record the features at the sites, map them using a drone, and also, if there were suitable samples, to collect a number of tree ring samples to better understand the sort of temporal history of their construction and use. And as you can see here, what we have is a kind of standard sheep camp for that area, with a hogan, a crib log, hogan, a shade house, and then this corral that's built up against this rock wall, or not a rock wall, but like natural sort of rocky ridge. And taking the time to do this prepared me to kind of dive into the data and extract a series of sort of generalizable traits that could be turned into sort of modelable factors. And taking these factors for sort of the location of sheep camps and the like, I developed a site suitability model that was taught on Black Mesa and then applied to the landscape of the Phase 3 study area in Dinétah, this early Navajo homeland. And so, well, that brings us up to the last bit of work, right? This was the most recent phase of the project, and it was centered in the sort of Gobernador drainage in northwestern New Mexico, the area known as Dinétah. And in total, I used, what I ended up doing was taking that predictive model and using it to choose a subset of sites to examine further. Dinétah has been a hotbed of Navajo archaeological research, honestly, since the earliest days, but most notably since the late 80s and the early 90s, it's been the center for a lot of oil and gas development in the region. And actually now the area is sort of scarred by natural gas wells that dot the landscape. And so the ironic nature is that it's a super important sacred landscape for Navajo people, but it has been completely, and I think kind of irreversibly impacted by this energy development. Of course, that work, the cultural resource management work associated with the development of those resources is what enabled us to get a better sense of what early Navajo life was like during the Spanish colonial period. And so what you see here then are the collection of sites, 12 sites total that I examined, and they're focused on two sort of clusters, each of which contain a pueblito fortress. One of the things I was interested in, right, is the relationship between these special sites and the more general sort of daily habitation sites that are occupied by families on a day-to-day basis. And so the half of these sites were chosen based on the results of earlier CRM work in the area, which identified either the faunal remains from Western domesticates or features that they thought might be pens or corrals. And then the remaining 6 were chosen using the predictive model to help, ID areas that might be sort of high potential for pastoral or potential pastoral site locations, and then visiting them and based on my experiences herding in the previous year, to choose those sites that seem to have a sort of best feel for having additional pastoral markers. And so at the core of this work was a focused archaeological survey and remapping campaign combined with dendroarchaeological sampling of culturally modified trees at these sites. Because many of them don't have suitable architectural wood, the focus was turned to the trees themselves and sampling axe cut limbs and stumps and the like to get a sense of when people were living on that landscape. And also there was a series of artifact analyses and the like that were done through a catch and release strategy that focused on identifying objects in the field, taking photographs, making initial notes, and then leaving these materials at the site. The only thing that actually ended up being collected, other than the tree ring samples, were a series of soil cores that were taken with the goal of testing for phosphorus at the sites. Phosphorus is a great marker for the presence of organic materials and has been used in other parts of the world by archaeologists to identify things like trash pits, middens, market areas, and things like that to kind of conduct a systematic survey of different regions or regions within or areas within sites, and then mapping out sort of where hotspots might be to focus additional work. Normally that's excavation, but in my case, I was interested in looking for evidence of the penning of animals. And so what I wanted to do was then conduct a final analysis that tried to identify dung spherolites. They're little dung spherolites are little calcitic crystals that form in the digestive tract of ruminants, like sheep, goats, cattle, and they're not as common in other types of animals, including carnivores, humans, and other omnivores. And so the idea was that basically by mapping out the site, conducting a systematic soil survey, and then examining those soil samples for their phosphorus content and to ID high phosphorus samples, I could then go one step further and try to ID spherolites to see if those hotspots were associated potentially with pens or those sorts of features. Picture, if you will, an inverted pyramid as you kind of slowly work your way down through those steps. And so to illustrate this process, right, here's one of the sites, LA 106203. It was most likely occupied during the 1720s to the 1740s, and in previous work at the site had identified a burned hogan feature, middens, a sweat lodge, and the remains of a possible hogan, as well as a variety of sort of Navajo pottery and the heavily charred and fragmented remains of domestic sheep, burro, and also native species like elk and deer. So after mapping and identifying the features, or identifying features and then mapping them, I noticed at this site, for example, one of the things that drew my attention was this possible hogan. On the ground, it didn't seem quite right, and so I was interested in exploring it further. So what ended up happening was we did this, laid a 15-meter grid across the sites and systematically took soil cores with these footstep plungers with additional samples taken from areas of interest, like the hogan site that I just showed, or the possible hogan site that I just showed. And then that information was taken to, those soil samples were taken to an environmental analysis lab in Farmington, in Envirotech, who processed the samples for the phosphorus content. And taking that, I was able to process them in a GIS framework and create these sort of phosphorus scapes, if you will. Basically showing the concentration of phosphorus across the site and highlighting areas where phosphorus hotspots might be associated with certain features, landforms, and the like. And then based on that, I selected a further subset of those soil samples to be examined for the fecal spherulites. All in all, I collected 516 soil samples, and this final subset for the sort of microscopic analysis only ended up being 28 samples. They were submitted to a paleoecologist, Dr. Chad Yost, who analyzed them, and a few weeks ago, I got the final results, which show that, surprise, surprise, some of these high phosphorus areas do have dung spherulites associated with them. And so what you see here is basically each row is a site, is associated with a particular site. And the interesting thing is that several of the sites have heavily damaged potential spherulites that for some reason, there might be a range of factors that are responsible, but the ID isn't, it's not possible to make a solid ID. On the other hand, there are a couple of examples that seem to be pretty solid and demonstrate good evidence for spherulites being there. So, and one of the things that kind of emerges as particularly interesting then is actually how these sites, where these samples are on the landscape and what lessons there might be for the archaeologists. And as you see on the left, is the Morris 1 Pueblito. Positive IDs came back from both the samples at the points, from samples that were taken from where these red dots were. And in these instances, the samples that were heavily weathered are from these sort of more open area exposed regions. But interestingly, the better samples come from LA 106-203, the sort of example site I showed earlier, and this Morris 1 Pueblito, where this site, the sample from this site came from underneath a slightly protected overhang created by the boulder on which the fortress rests. So with these factors in mind, I guess I wanted to take a step back and consider, what does all of this mean? I'm not going to claim that I know, but I have some ideas. And I think, one of the things that, first comes to light is that, okay, the technique, this general approach, sort of working through these various steps to narrow in on areas where there might be potential corral or penning features does seem to work. But there's not a lot of spherulites that come out, and you would expect that if there was a pen or a corral, there would be a concentration of these dung remnants that would speak to the herding and penning of these animals over the years. And so one of the first things that comes to mind is, like, how do we interpret this? And is it a case of simply looking in the wrong place? Are these just kind of quirks of nature? Are they remnant from later Hispanic sheep herding? I personally don't think so. I do think that this sort of the paucity of spherulites in these samples reflects both some analytic and sort of methodological considerations when it comes to looking at the soil samples themselves. What I showed were simply the result of basic soil smears, and there are a couple of other more intensive approaches that can be taken to those same samples to try to concentrate and improve the analyst's ability to identify spherulites. And so that work is ongoing now and will be sort of the future direction that this project takes. But there are also some things to consider, like diagenetic factors, things that over time may have affected the spherulites themselves, slightly acidic soils, running water, post-depositional disturbances and the like. And also maybe the fact that the landscape itself and the plants of the Southwest might not be totally amenable to the creation of large quantities of spherulites within the guts of these animals that are then deposited. And so if then you take this at face value, that there does seem to be evidence for potential penning at these sites, one of the things that comes up is, well, there's multiple lines of evidence. So there's this evidence for penning, corralling, evidence for the consumption of Western domesticates at these sites. There are heavily fragmented faunal remains that were identified in situ. And I think together you can start to draw out areas where people may have been working with their animals. And I think one of the key takeaways too, though, is that the number of animals may have not been very high. Historically, Navajo herds are, the touchstone for thinking about Navajo herding is the turn of the 20th century. But the herds of that scale, the hundreds, thousands of animals that led to the livestock production period, at these early moments, I suspect that they're actually not all that great, that they're becoming important parts of daily life, but the degree to which people are dependent on their herds is starting to build at this time and is not the sort of overwhelming focus. What these arrows here show too is that I think with this technique, you can start to identify sites on the landscape that have potential relationships based on the presence of herding features, and suggesting that there might be kin groups cooperating within particular sort of residential clusters. What you see here, the black and red arrows indicate sites that were sampled during the course of the phase 3 work, while the white arrow indicates another one of these fortress sites, Rameen Canyon ruin, that was not examined in any great detail. And so what you see then are a series of sites in close relationship to each other, but that there doesn't seem to be evidence for some sites then they all seem to be roughly contemporaneous. And so it might be the case that certain individuals within this sort of group, and they're all within eyesight of each other, the distance between these two sites here is only maybe 300, 400 yards. That people are living next to each other, they're neighbors, they're probably relatives, but they're all engaged in different practices, including herding and presumably farming, hunting, and gathering and the like. And so by being able to identify these potential herding areas, we can start to advance some ideas about the nature of community interaction and relationships in between groups. And there are some other takeaways, I think, from this sort of the work. And one of the things that emerge is that it's important, especially when dealing with pastoralism, to keep seasonality in mind. Not just the seasonality of sort of usage and where people might be, say, during the summer versus the winter, but also the effect of seasonality on the ability of archaeologists to look at and consider sites. What this little inset image shows is a really dense cluster of wolfberry, this sort of bright green shrub that you can see here. And it's associated with really disturbed soils in the Southwest, like ruins, home sites, and corrals that have been abandoned over time. They really like the sort of richer nutrients in those soils. And so I did a lot of the work in the winter to avoid monsoons and that sort of issue. But one of the things that was removed then was being able to examine the landscape for more subtle sort of vegetative differences that might hint at the presence of other features. And so going, another angle for future work is to identify areas like this and to test them to see if they might represent areas where animals were being enclosed or kept. And as you can see, it's quite interesting because the site is equidistant to 3 of the sites that are shown here in this area, but there actually isn't any indication of sort of habitation or larger, more intensive use of that particular area for other purposes. So maybe there's some sort of communal pen feature, or that animals were kept there by the residents of the pueblito, which is a relatively inaccessible location. So playing with these kinds of ideas then allows us to more, I think, more accurately begin to get a sense of what early herding was like. In doing the work, one of the things that also sort of came to mind, or came to the forefront rather, was that mobility is truly a central theme to the story of Navajo people. And even before the rise of the herding tradition, there's a lot of movement on the landscape. And during the colonial period, what we know from the Spanish text and from the archaeological data is that mobility, it enables Navajo people to both indirectly and directly resist Spanish attempts to missionize and pacify people in Dinétah. Throughout the 18th century, you have Navajo folks that are living and moving all throughout the Four Corners region. And this process of settlement and increasing of herds is only really curtailed in the 1860s, when the US shows up on the scene and institutes the scorched earth policy that results in the long walk and the internment at Fort Sumner. That really sort of marks the start of the modern reservation system, the modern sort of colonial experience of Navajo people. And even in that time, though, even during the reservation period, which we're still living in now, one of the things that emerges is that mobility is still key. This is discussed in a little bit more detail in the article that I had mentioned before. But what you see is after Fort Sumner, the rebuilding of Navajo herds and the intensification of Navajo herding, taking it to a level that went beyond what had been established previously. And you see up until the livestock production period, people are moving across the landscape seasonally, and it fits this idea of transhumance, so sort of seasonal transhumance of people moving from lowlands to highlands, or moving around the greater Four Corners region to take advantage of various natural resources for their herds. Following livestock reduction period, though, you start to see the kind of condensing of these practices, with people being constrained to grazing areas and setting up sort of established systems of land use, of pastoral land use within their designated home areas, with sort of winter camps and summer camps. But there's still a fair amount of mobility. Yet as 20th century Navajo society becomes more integrated into the Western world, people take wage work and are away from this type of lifestyle. You get the sort of centralization of these practices, and there's less movement and more intensive use of the landscape, with people sort of switching between sort of moving within a localized seasonal round. And arguably since the 90s, the early 2000s, what you have in a lot of places, because of increased population and the increasing land use constraints, you have smaller herds and more centralized herding systems in which people are they have a home base, essentially. And daily herding is run out of there, rather than using a multitude of different camps to kind of move animals through the landscape. So that brings us almost up to the end. So I guess coming full circle, right? So what does this tell us, and what can this project as an example of a particularly Diné form of indigenous archaeology contribute? I think that returning to the example of the Miss Navajo contest, in 2017, the fry bread making portion of the pageant was canceled. It was removed, and there was an uproar. People like their fry bread, but the rationale was, why should we celebrate food associated with captivity? And the thing that I find interesting in all of this is that, well, sheep and herding and those sorts of things could arguably be framed as also, things associated with colonialism and it, its influences. But if the pageant is a sense, or offers one a sense of sort of how contemporary Navajo culture feels about these things, well, it seems that the sheep-mindedness that I talked about earlier is still in full effect. And yet the pageant's sort of cancellation of the fry bread making contest highlights another issue, right? Is that the dietary changes, the lifestyle changes that have gone hand in hand with the incorporation of Navajo society into the sort of larger Western world has resulted in a range of health issues and sort of social issues associated with them. And so what we have here is, apologies to data scientists, that are here, but what we have on the right is a graph showing sort of uptick in the rates of diabetes on the Navajo Nation from the early 50s until the late 80s. And what you see here, there's this sort of rough correspondence between the decline of sort of wide-scale, highly mobile pastoral practices among Navajo people and the entrance into the greater American economy and sort of societal structure. And Navajo folks increasingly have been pushing back against this. And one of the movements that I think, has benefited from taking a step back and asking sort of what's going on is this idea of food sovereignty, of trying to return Navajo folks to a traditional diet, and with that return also encourage the practice of more traditional, more mobile lifeways, lifestyles, being more active, being engaged in sort of activities that put you on the landscape, like herding, like farming. And a key part of this, right, is the return to community-based knowledge, asking relatives, family, friends to share what they know about these older practices related to food and traditional Navajo cuisine, with the goal of sort of separating ourselves from dependence on processed goods and the like. And I think in this particular regard, archaeology is a really powerful tool, because that unique kind of material lens on the past that I had mentioned at the start is, I think, really well suited to highlighting and providing material evidence for a lot of the elements of this particular movement. That you can, by identifying areas where people were hurting in the past, you get a sense then of, well, they were likely engaged in similar practices regarding the use and consumption of say sheep, goats, cattle, etc., that we do today. And if we can understand that, then we can also start to understand other aspects of the older, more traditional, sort of less harmful lifeways. And I think, and as sort of as a final note, right, this is a plug for the upcoming fall issue of Kiva. And I think what we're seeing now are a range of Navajo archaeologists and also non-native archaeologists who are interested in collaborating with Navajo folks that are trying to use these frameworks and these sort of archaeological techniques, the focus on material, to start understanding these various past practices, whether it be weaving and how it's integral to maintaining the framework of Navajo society, or the introduction, the conduct, and then impact, negative impact of the uranium industry on the reservation. These are all how to say it. These are all ideas and themes that are of great interest to Navajo people, and I think that archaeology can help to shed a lens on how they were received in the past, and how Navajo folks negotiated those interests to, well, emerge and continue to the present. So with that, I want to say thank you to everybody who's logged in and listening. And I suppose I'll open up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Wade. That was a great talk. I learned a lot. And you got compliments coming in on the chat for the talk. There's a question that came in first, which says that they saw a dog besides a woman herding sheep early in the talk, and they asked, do Navajo use dogs in sheep herding?
Yes. Yes, although they're not necessarily, the use is a little more casual than sort of what you see with people training, say, like border collies or things like that in other parts of the world. Sheep are used to help herd, but the sort of development of a particular sort of breed or animal like that isn't, or as far as I know, hasn't been done.
You kind of answered this one, I think, with regards to the wolfberry, but someone wrote in and asked, are there certain plants that grow or show as indicators of where phosphorus was deposited? Are there others besides the wolfberry?
Yeah, there's a ton. Basically, plants that like sort of disturbed soils and are more interested in like disturbed and more nutrient-rich soils will definitely sort of colonize an abandoned corral area. One of the things, though, that makes it a bit difficult is that over time, the difference in vegetation between the corral area and the surrounding area will sort of naturally kind of fade. And so the further you go back into the past, the less distinct those markers are, although they are definitely present. So with the sort of ethnoarchaeological component, where I was looking at the more recent historic sites on Black Mesa, a lot of those areas definitely had, they had a lot of plants that were from the floodplain where the main grazing took place. And so you got a really clear vegetative difference between, say, a site that was higher up on a hill or, in the trees, and then you had this rich cluster of things like saltbush and other plants that were the normal grazing plants. So you definitely see it, but over time it becomes much less visible, which is why I'm arguing for a turn towards these geochemical and micro remains based approaches to try to better understand how things might be going on, 300, 400 years in the past.
Thank you. That's interesting. I got a question here that asks, are there ways to make comparisons with similar sites, contemporary or past, from other cultures? I think that means other pastoral and especially sheep pastoral cultures.
One sec. I had the chat open, and can you repeat the question? I think I looked at the wrong one.
Yep. Are there ways to make comparisons with similar sites, contemporary or past, from other sheep pastoral cultures?
Yeah, and so this idea of the pastoral landscape approach is in many ways that in action, right? The pastoral landscape approach has been sort of developed and implemented in Central Asia, where they're looking at more mobile herding, where people are living in these ger structures, and sort of moving across the landscape. And what you see in those cases are you get people, if they return to sites time and again, or even if they're used for a single season, you get sort of site layouts that reflect corralling, habitation, and other activities on the landscape. And so that general approach then is what you see here, and you do see similar things in other cultures. And so having that cross-cultural comparison is definitely useful. And even within the Southwest, we talked about cultures, right? That one of the things, right, to emphasize is that Hispanic people were herding. They brought the animals. They incorporated Pueblo communities into the herding systems. But one of the things that interests me about Navajo herding is that it is uncontrolled in that sort of colonial framework, right? Early Spanish folks were engaged in the kind of herding practices, or within a sort of semi-feudal Spanish imperial kind of system, whereas Navajo folks were incorporated into a life way that didn't have those structures in place in the same way, right? There was no encomendero to say, like, you need to herd my sheep. There was no priest saying you need to go herd my sheep because we need to send a tax tribute to Mexico, right? And so the nature of even herding in the Southwest by different cultures varies substantially, I think, between these different groups.
Yeah, that's interesting. And is that just because they were physically distant from the area where the Spanish were?
I think physical distance is part of it, although there were also attempts to missionize the Navajo at different points within the Spanish colonial period. But this was sort of what I was mentioning earlier, when the security of Spanish colonial New Mexico was always kind of tenuous. And you have pressures from the east in the form of Plains Apache and Comanche folks, the Utes to the north, and Navajos and other Apache groups to the west. And so I think the ability to sort of expand further and take over with the rather sort of limited population that was in the Rio Grande Valley just didn't really lend itself to that.
Thank you. Here's a good question. Any horse-mindedness appear in your research? Do you have some ideas of what kind of understanding is possible when considering the growth of sheep and horses together within Navajo culture?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that comes out of this is, yes, there is horse-mindedness. The horse is a key part of traditional Navajo culture, with they're the focus of a lot of prayers and songs and
It looks like you froze, Wade. Are you still there?
Dang.
Well, at least we made it through the majority of the presentation.
We did. It's 5:20, so it's probably time to stop now anyway. A couple more questions did come in, Wade. Maybe we can figure out a way for you to get somebody an answer. One person, this is really interesting to me. Any examples of how being sheep-minded introduced or created new words or language into the Diné community? And then another, is the sheep herding style rooted in a nomadic lifestyle? So lots of good questions from people who are engaged in your talk, and I'm glad you got onto the chat. I hope you got a chance to look at it, because there's dozens of compliments on your talk in the chat. Really, thank you for taking the time to prepare and then deliver this talk, and it was just wonderful. So thank you, Wade, very much.
Thanks, everyone. I'll be sharing Wade's email address after the event today. So if your question didn't get answered live, please feel free to reach out to Wade directly. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Taylor, and thank you everyone who tuned in.